The Russian Revolution was a long, bloody change in power between the Tsarist autocracy and a new Bolshevik government in Russia. It began in 1917, when the Tsar fell out of power, and formally ended in 1922, when the Bolshevik government took control of all of Russia. Russia as it exists today is largely the same geographically as it was in the early 20th century, when the revolution began. Although it mainly borders Asian countries, Russia was primarily involved in European politics, as it obtained most of its imported resources from European nations. More importantly, it was involved in the web of alliances that led to World War I, and entered the war soon after its beginning on the side of the Allied powers. World War I did not treat Russia kindly. Many vital supply routes were cut early in the war, leaving the Russian army undersupplied and vulnerable. As a result, they were on the losing side of most battles. In addition, inflation of the Russian currency led to food shortages in most major cities, promoting unrest and eventually protest. At the time, the Tsar Nicholas II was the absolute ruler of Russia. He and his appointed officials oversaw every political development in the empire. There was also a legislative assembly, or Duma, which had limited power. As the situation in World War I worsened, Nicholas II's advisors recommended that he establish a constitutional government or run the risk of rebellion. He did not act on their suggestion. Soon, in Petrograd, a major western Russian city, the factory workers of the city went on strike. Within days, all industry in the city ground to a halt. The Tsar attempted to send army units to stop the uprisings, but the loyalty of his soldiers was uncertain, and those who didn't join the protesters refused to attack them. Shortly after he returned to the city from commanding soldiers at the front, Tsar Nicholas II was placed under house arrest by defected soldiers. After the successful taking of power from the Tsar, a provisional government was formed to handle the affairs of the nation, primarily consisting of moderate liberal politicians. However, a counterpart to that government was formed by Russian socialists called the Petrograd Soviet, a committee of officials elected by the laborers of Petrograd. Over the next few months, the two committees fought over power, with the provisional government gradually losing its power as negotiations continued, until eventually they had barely any political resources at all compared to the Petrograd Soviet and their backers, the most important of which was the Bolshevik Party. The Bolshevik Party was one of the primary forces in the revolution. After their formation in 1903, they were largely relegated to the political sidelines for their views being contrary to those of the Tsar. Soon after the Tsar's deposition, the Bolsheviks' leader, Vladimir Lenin, returned from exile in Switzerland. He came to define the Bolshevik Party as one that championed the common worker above all else, and also promoted Marxism as an economic system. Soon after his return, support for the Bolsheviks rose rapidly. Several prominent Bolsheviks were soon jailed by the provisional government in an attempt to suppress uprising, but they were soon freed by the Petrograd Soviet. After several months of the provisional government co-ruling with the Petrograd Soviet, Lenin led the Bolshevik Party in an open rebellion against the provisional government. A largely bloodless takeover of Petrograd followed. Bolshevik troops, organized as the Red Army, quickly took over government buildings and the Winter Palace, an important symbol of the Tsar's rule. The Tsar himself had been in exile for much of the past year in the Ural Mountains, but was soon transported to the Bolshevik stronghold of Yekaterinburg, where he, his family, and those who chose to follow them into exile were summarily executed. Uprisings in many other cities with large Bolshevik presences followed. Soon, opposition forces known as the White Army formed, and a long civil war began. The White Army was supported in some aspects by the governments of the U.S., the United Kingdom, and the Japanese Empire, who had interests in maintaining the Tsarist autocracy. But even with that support on the side of the White Army, after the ashes settled in 1923, the Bolsheviks had taken control of all of Russia and began to rebuild the country. The aftermath of the Russian Civil War was a desolate one. Many millions had been slain in the conflict of the past few years, and the country's infrastructure had been heavily damaged. In addition to this, emigration and famine became huge problems for the redeveloping nation, with up to 5 million dying in the famine of 1921. Eventually, however, the country returned to some semblance of stability, with the incorporation of several other Soviet nations forming the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR. From then until the current day, the nation has endured through war, tyranny, and further revolution to become the country that is present today, an important power in a constantly changing world.